the McMartin Preschool in Manhattan Beach, California. The scene, it is alleged, of one of the biggest and most bizarre cases of sexual abuse of children in anyone's memory.
These pictures were taken in January 1984, just days before the school was closed. It is located in an upper middle-class suburb of Los Angeles called Manhattan Beach. What made this case so sensational, so gruesome, was the accusation that 41 youngsters over a 6-year period had not just been sexually molested, but had also been forced to participate in satanic rites and pornographic pictures. There were also charges that to keep the children quiet, animals had been mutilated before their eyes. To add to the sensationalism, the 7 people arrested were not only pillars of the community, they were also responsible for the children's welfare.
So to begin, in 1983, Judy Johnson noticed a rash on her 2.5-year-old son's, how do I say this? On her 2.5-year-old son's behind?
No.
Bum?
No.
Bottom?
No.
Sorry, I just didn't like the idea of saying her 2.5-year-old son's asshole.
No.
Anyway, so Judy sees this rash and jumped to the conclusion that he had been abused at his preschool. Now, whether or not the little one initially confirmed or denied the abuse is in question, but he did point the finger at his preschool teacher. Now, Judy Johnson then made several more outlandish claims aimed at the preschool, including that they were killing animals.
How on earth can you justify this?
And torturing children, even flying. Now, why would she jump to such extreme conclusions and throw out these outlandish accusations? Well, the diagnosed schizophrenia and heavy self-medication with alcohol probably had some sway in her decision-making.
My name is Judy Johnson, and I want to report a crime.
Yes, ma'am.
My 2-year-old son had been molested at the McMartin Preschool.
The Manhattan Beach Police Department's a small department, and they had a female officer named Jane Hogue, who was kind of a tough old school cop, and so she interviewed that child. And the child, who was 2.5 years old, had said that Raymond Bucky had molested him.
Now, after initial investigations turned up nothing, the police, in their infinite wisdom, sent out a letter to 200 parents that suggested their children may have been abused by the teachers of the McMartin Preschool. Now, they did make sure to state that no evidence of such activities were ever found. I mean, what a great idea that was. Surely that wouldn't lead to any panic or hysteria. Unfucking-believable.
The child was examined by a doctor at UCLA, and the doctor found something consistent with molestation. And based on that examination, Raymond Bucky was arrested. So now you have this investigation of a child abuse suspect. Word of it had gotten out. They had to explain it somehow. Judy Johnson mentioned that her child had said 2 other kids were abused. So the Manhattan Beach Police Department wrote up a very succinct, simple letter, which went out to the McMartin parents. It said, we don't wish to cause alarm, but if you could talk to your children, we'd appreciate it. And if you have any concerns, please call us.
At the basis of it is this long warning advisory for all the parents to go out and talk to their kids and their families and their friends about molestation that was going on. Happened to some kids, may have happened to your kids too.
Now, at this point, it would be fair to assume that everyone had their bases covered, that they'd crossed all the T's and dotted all the I's, that child abuse was the only logical conclusion to come to. I mean, you wouldn't want to start making accusations and arresting people if you weren't absolutely sure. I mean, that would just be fucking insane, wouldn't it?
That mother came to be belief that her child was being sodomized, and the only place she could think of where a male had an opportunity to be in contact with her little boy was at the McMartin Preschool, because her child was having itching and discomfort around his anus at night. He would wake up crying. So she took him to a local hospital. They examined the child. They did not raise the issue of sexual abuse, but they referred the child to the UCLA Medical Center. They examined the child again, and that's where they raised the bar by saying, child's anus is suspicious for sexual abuse. And that's because the mother had told them of her suspicions and because of the findings of this redness and some signs of scratching. Now, what they didn't do, what neither the initial hospital did or the UCLA Medical Center, this internationally known University of California medical facility, didn't do, was the most basic pediatric diagnostic test on an extremely common problem with children. It's called pinworms.
So, pinworms, or as we just call them in the UK, worms. Well, they're a fairly common issue with children. The worms live in the large intestine just below the anus, and then at night they will emerge to lay their eggs. It's pretty gross, but it is what it is. Now, these eggs, they're irritable and tend to lead to excessive scratching and rashes. Now, the way you check for these worms is to apply some tape to the affected area, and then you view that tape through a microscope. And the eggs are visible plain as day. Simple. Now, neither hospital did this. Not even to at least rule it out. Instead, they allowed the schizophrenic alcoholic to sink further into her own delusions by saying, yes, these symptoms could very well be in line with the type of abuse you've described. Now, you'd think ruling out all other options before partially affirming the worst case scenario would be standard practice, but I suppose the 80s were just a different time.
3 generations of McMartins were arrested. Grandmother Virginia, daughter Peggy McMartin Bucky, her son Raymond Bucky, his sister Peggy Ann Bucky, as well as 3 teachers. At their arraignment in April 1984, the prosecutor said the defendants were so dangerous they should be jailed without bail. 5 of them were. The parents of the children were incensed.
The judge kept the bail high, partly on the grounds that these former teachers could be dangerous to children if released. They have been indicted, after all, on the belief that they sexually assaulted and terrorized more than 100 children in their care. So the suspect, Ray Bucky, for example, still faces an unprecedented $1 million bail. And the judge has indicated that he may not accept bail from them in the form of real estate, and that even their cash may be viewed as tainted and not accepted. So 7 people who were once respected in their community and have virtually no prior records are now in jail indefinitely, viewed by authorities as child molesters.
So, to lay this all out, Judy's kid had a rash, and this couldn't have possibly been just a minor irritation cleared up with some skin cream. No, he was clearly sodomised by the devil. Satan had put his fingers to work and was tickling the taint of this poor child. I mean, surely the schizophrenic alcoholic mother isn't lost in her own hysterical wild imaginings. No, obviously there was devilry afoot, and who else to point the finger at than the elderly grandmother sporting her goofy earrings and smelling like herbal mints and her entire family of preschool teachers. I mean, how could we not see it before? These people are the lapdogs of Satan, and they will feed your child into the gaping maws of hell. I mean, Jesus Christ. And with the media reporting on this story being almost completely one-sided,
I want them out of society. They should never, ever be allowed to be with other children or anybody else, for that matter.
The Martin family were, for want of a better term, in a bit of a pickle. Now, it's not just that one mother pointed the finger. That would be lunacy. That was just the first rolling snowball that started the avalanche. You see, a lot of children were questioned, and they all eventually had roughly the same story of abuse and torture. Now, to understand how this happened, we need to look at the techniques used by this woman, Kee McFarlane.
The evidence of abuse was largely developed by social worker Kee McFarlane, who used puppets to get the children who were between the ages of 2 and 6 to reveal what had happened.
You're afraid. If you want to get it out of you, you can help yourself and you can help other children. If you're afraid to tell your parents, you can call us. We will help you tell it and we'll help you tell your parents.
So, in order to do that, I want to give you a brief summary of coercive and suggestive questioning and how it works to implant false memories. You see, unfortunately, the human mind is far more suggestible than we'd probably like to believe, and so it's not too hard that with enough gentle prodding that we can be led to believe things or even admit to things that simply didn't happen. See, if you present yourself as an expert, then trust tends to be granted with little question. And with some positive reinforcement and the introduction of key details that did take place to establish a baseline, you can start to work in smaller ideas and nudge a person's imagination to take over and fill in the blanks that you're setting up. You see, memory isn't perfect to begin with. It's not an exact snapshot. Your recall of an event will warp and fade over time, and after a while, it becomes more of an assumption of a moment that took place, which means those assumptions can be guided and pushed into forming memories that can feel incredibly real. And with a child who is already far more susceptible to manipulation, this technique is far easier to employ. Now, I'm not suggesting that a bunch of clinicians maliciously implanted memories into a bunch of kids, because that's not quite what happened. But you see, when a supposed expert has the idea that something terrible has occurred to a child, it becomes their mission, I suppose, to make these children remember so their abusers can be brought to justice. I mean, it would just be the human thing to do after all. And so, if the child has no memory of the event, the clinician will help them find the missing memories by suggesting again and again that these events did take place, inviting them to imagine that the abuse was real and play out the events as if they did take place.
We have heard it 100 times or more from children, the same things, the same games, the same descriptions.
Then enforce the idea that other children have already said that the abuse did in fact happen, and that they wouldn't want to be silly and not remember like the other good and clever children.
All right, Mr. Monkey, are you going to be stupid or are you going to be smart? Help us out here. Now, some people think you're stupid, Mr. Monkey. Mr. Monkey with the chicken, and he can't remember any of the naked games, but we think we know a game that Mr. Monkey remembers. It's the Naked Movie Star game. Do you remember that game? Or is your memory too bad?
And then, as the child begins to play along, the clinician believes that they're reconstructing the memory, when in fact, they're just reacting to the constant suggestive questioning and overt reinforcement of the events that the clinician believes are real. And because of this, the clinician believes the memory is unlocked, the admission of abuse is on record, and the accusations can begin. It's pretty fucked.
Here's Big Bird. Now, what this little girl did was she squeaked once for no, and twice for yes. When Jennifer was touched at the school, was it a hand that touched her? No. Did Ray sometimes do yucky things to some of the kids? Sometimes people we like can touch kids in places that are uncomfortable and scary. Did you know that Ray did that to some of the kids? No. We don't want to hear any more no's. No.
They met with me for an hour, and they were gone, out of my life and I out of theirs. The concept that somehow magically this could have turned them into children who came to believe that they were raped and sodomized is an incredible one to me.
Babette Spittler was one of the defendants. A teacher at the school, she was charged with molestation and jail for 2.5 months before the charges were dropped. He says McFarland brainwashed the children.
She had no proof of anything when she interviewed any of those kids. But she didn't assume that anybody was innocent. She assumed we were all guilty.
But the children in the interviews said that they had been...
Do they really? Or are the puppets saying something happened after they'd been questioned and questioned and questioned?
In the DA's office, all kinds of doubts developed, particularly about the fact that the mother of the first complaining child was psychotic, but they just kept on going. It was like the Titanic. It was like a roller coaster or a ship that just was out of control and couldn't stop.
What happens then is the parents start to talk to their kids, and then they start to talk to each other, and then they start to compare notes, and pretty soon emotionally involved parents are engaging in leading and suggestive questioning of their child. Once these cases are contaminated, it's almost impossible to know with any degree of certainty what actually happened.
It was obvious in the interviews that all kinds of techniques were highly suggestible, highly pressuring, and as capable of creating false memories of abuse in children, often permanent memories.
So, with that being the case, the first question I would ask would simply be, why was this professional psychotherapist using such shady techniques? Surely she knows better. I mean, she's had all the relevant training, right? Well, it turns out that our little Miss Key McFarlane might have been bending the truth a little. See, she did have a degree in fine arts and social work, which in no way gives you the requisite skills to call yourself a psychotherapist, or especially a child psychotherapist. In fact, when it came to psychotherapy, she had 0 professional licenses. Well, oopsie daisy. It's a good thing no one suffered any legal, financial or mental ramifications from all this. Oh no, wait a second. Aren't I just being the silliest little sausage? Because all of that happened, didn't it? Oh no. Now, in spite of the only evidence against the McMartin family and the 3 teachers that got roped into this was the interviews with the children that each lasted for over an hour and showed them denying the allegations until after the intense puppet show and the overt insistence that they were stupid and cowardly if they didn't accuse the teachers of abusing them, well, apparently that didn't matter, and it seemed that in a lot of cases, if not all of them, the only footage that was shown to parents was the child agreeing that the abuse took place, and not them denying it and looking incredibly confused for 55 minutes while Key McFarlane got them to play with naked plushies and spun them stories about naked fashion shows and animal sacrifice. And I suppose that would go some way to explaining the judge's verdict on the defendant's bail.
And the court does find that the public safety does justify the following bail given the great number of charges, the period of years over which the alleged conduct is to have occurred, the vulnerability of the victims and that class of victims, many children, dozens of children subjected to serious sexual acts.
And the judge indicated he probably would not let the defendants put up real estate to bail out, and that he might even reject their cash on the grounds that it is money that these teachers earned while they were committing criminal acts. All of these questions and the pleas by the teachers are put off until April 6.
Now, I fully understand the idea that if an individual is guilty of a particularly heinous crime, that the idea of granting them bail so they can still live freely for a time can be seen as an incredibly contentious issue, although it does fall in line with the tenet of innocent until proven guilty. But on the flip side, if you are innocent of the crimes that you've been accused of, then it can be your only avenue for freedom, of which, you deserve. But if the judge then makes the claim that you're unable to put up your property or your real estate to pay for the bail, and that he won't even accept your cash if you even had it, because it's tainted due to being earned while committing all of the crimes that you've been accused of, well, isn't that just assuming guilt right off the bat? Like, doesn't that go against the entire code of the American judicial system? I mean, it was a judge who said it, and I'm not a lawyer, but it does seem a bit weird.
I set bail at $1 million.
Well, I'll just put up my home as collateral. It's all I have.
No, you can't do that, because you're clearly guilty.
But it's my right to...
You want to talk about rights? What about the children's rights not to be locked up in cages while you sacrifice animals to the devil, having fire orgies and flying around like a demon bat, you fucking monster? I'm going to make sure you go to prison in spite of the incredibly limited evidence, or in most cases, the complete lack thereof. So look forward to Cell Block C, where you're going to die screaming as you take cocks the size of Coke cans until you bleed to death, you fucking evil bastard.
I mean, you can't argue with logic like that. It's just too sound.
Meanwhile, the district attorney said his investigation is continuing full bore with the grand jury, and that 100 more kids are waiting in the wings to be interviewed. I asked him about the defense argument that those interviews were planting stories in the children's heads.
Well, that's the standard defense in any type of child molestation case. And we see that in every single case, and I've seen that in cases that I tried when I was a trial deputy in this office. That's the standard defense, that the child has conjured this up, and for one reason or another. But based on the evidence that we have in this case, I am very confident that defense will not stand up.
Now, the scary thing is, what this man is saying is that when you boil it down, the idea that what these children are saying just simply isn't true is ridiculous, and that defence simply will not stand up in court. Now, what exactly do you do against that argument? I mean, you can't prove a negative. It's insanity. And with more and more children being, well, I'll just say this, indoctrinated every day, the evidence just kept piling up and more people turned against the McMartins as time went on. You know, we have this idea of a nightmare scenario. Well, this is one of the finest examples out there. And so, just to boil it down, imagine you are one of the McMartins. You have done nothing wrong. You have been a kind and caring, attentive preschool teacher. Then one day, an alcoholic, schizophrenic, accuses you of abusing their child, and then, a few months later, you're being held in prison with no chance of bail, and everyone on the outside world believes you have abused and tortured hundreds of kids in the name of Satan. I mean, it sounds insane, but it actually happened. Now, all of this was being reported all over the news media, but the main man who broke this story wide open was Wayne Satz. He was all over this story and is credited as bringing it to the public's attention, a true hero of the people.
Wayne Satz was a highly respected Peabody Award-winning reporter. I'm sure he kind of thought the way any reporter would have thought. This is like a great story.
One mother noticed that her young son was having nightmares and difficulty sitting down and a redness on his bottom. Authorities would later conclude that her 2-year-old son had been sodomized. That was last summer. In the months since then, the number of possible victims have multiplied, to say the least.
But as Wayne Satz reports, the defendants will have a difficult time making bail. Wayne?
That may be so, Jerry. The judge kept the bail high, partly on the grounds that these former teachers could be dangerous to children if released.
Number 3855104. This is your story. It's all your story, but
well,
I do happen
it's the
to know
world's
the
story
fact
now.
that Children's Institute International has scraped along financially and carried an enormous burden on behalf of all society alone.
I'm sure they'll appreciate you saying that.
Yeah. Well, I know it to be the truth as you do. And more people do now, too.
And now Wayne Satz, this good old boy, well, he had an inside track right to the heart of the case. You see, he had a source that dished about all of the inside knowledge, including what the children were saying during their interviews. And why was this? Well, because conveniently enough, he was dating Key McFarlane. And so, this created a feedback loop where he would have her on his show spewing out all the dirty gossip and how she helped these kids process their trauma, and doing so, she would be showered with praise and labelled as a hero of the children, their angel dragging them up from the abyss. And Mr. Satz, well, he got to keep reporting all the juicy gossip he was getting from his girlfriend. It was mutually beneficial symbiosis. Of course, it was completely destroying innocent lives and planting false memories of abuse into children's heads. But damn, did it sell well to the public, and they lapped it up.
Wake up, America. This is your wake-up call. We believe the children because once upon a time, we were the children, and nobody believed us.
That reporter had the inside information from the beginning on what these children were saying to the interviews. And it was blasted daily on Channel 7 in the most horrendous fashion. A child sexual abuse investigator should not talk to the media in advance of the court proceedings.
Authorities now believe that at least 60 young children were victimized, and that the ultimate number could well be much greater.
He, like the rest of the community, presumed guilt. That's when the case started to blow up.
So, how were the McMartins going to get out of this living hell? Well, when the first cracks in the case started to rear their ugly heads, like the children's stories not being consistent, the initial accuser being a lunatic, and the prosecution withholding that fact, then all the tapes showing the preceding hour leading up to the children admitting to the abuse, where they vehemently denied it, were seen, then there was the complete lack of any physical evidence, the fact that one of the accused hadn't even been working at the school during the time of the abuse. Okay, let me roll things back. I mean, these were more than just cracks in the case, so I'll rephrase. when the several gaping chasms in the case were seen for the obvious red flags that they were, it became apparent that maybe this case wasn't all it had cracked up to be. And subsequently, one of the prosecutors flipped and leaked the information to the press, which is when the doubt really started to seep in. And after extensive searches to look for any evidence of the supposed crimes, nothing was ever found.
No pornography that could be linked to the abuse that the children were describing has ever been found.
There should have been little animal carcasses. There should have been bodily fluids all over the preschool. They didn't have any of that.
So things slowly, and I mean slowly, were starting to turn around for the McMartin family and the two teachers that were accused alongside them. And then, in 1986, 2 years after they were arrested, a new district attorney took over the case and had the wherewithal to review the evidence, which was nothing aside from the tapes showing the supposed admissions from the children, and subsequently all charges were dropped for Virginia McMartin, Peggy Ann Buckey, Mary Ann Jackson, Betty Ryder, and Babette Spittler.
A review of those videotaped interviews led the current Los Angeles District Attorney Ira Reiner to drop all charges against 5 of the defendants. He dropped all charges against those 5, despite the fact that after an 18-month preliminary hearing, a judge had ordered all 7 defendants to stand trial. And what did Ira Reiner see on those videotapes?
But what we had here were these social workers and questioning the children, asking very leading and very suggestive questions of the children. They'd have little Bobby sitting there, and they'd say to Bobby, did the bad teacher touch you in a yucky way in this place right here? And Bobby would say no, and they would push a few times, and Bobby would continue to say no. Then they'd say, but wait a minute, Johnny has already told us that this happened. Now, you're just as smart as Johnny, aren't you? And after a little bit of this, then maybe Bobby would say, okay, he'd nod his head, yeah, it happened that way. Now, Bobby hasn't supplied any details. He has been bawled out, if you will, or chastised because he isn't as smart as someone who allegedly has already told them about this. He has been rewarded with praise when he says, yes, it did happen. What you have here is a situation then where hundreds of children had been questioned, and then this material is turned over to the district attorney's office. The district attorney then, at that time, without any investigation whatsoever, none at all, turns it over to the grand jury for indictment purposes. Not surprisingly, the grand jury indicted. Now, with that as a background, is it any surprise that you have the kind of case that developed? Certainly isn't. What you're charging is that the former district attorney, Philibosian, simply did a miserable job. What he did is he charged people without any investigation whatsoever. This case was submitted to the grand jury without any investigation. The grand jury returned indictments, and that started the ball rolling. You're charging Philibosian with an unprofessional job. Well, that hardly begins to describe it.
Now, just because these 5 women had their charges dropped, it doesn't mean that they came out of this situation unscathed. In fact, very, very, very far from it, because as a result of this case, they lost everything.
What happened to your individual lives because of these charges?
My character, my reputation has been destroyed.
Ms. Jackson?
We lost everything, almost everything that we had accumulated in 38 years of our married life.
Where do I start? During the time I was in jail, the custody of my children were taken away from me. During my jail time, I called them on the phone what times I could, because that privilege was not given to me very often.
Where were they?
With my brother. They were taken from the school that we had placed him in and arrested. At the time, my son was 8. He was right there again. He was probably under arrest.
Under arrest for what?
He doesn't know for what. I don't know for what. I don't know why they took him into custody. I was behind bars if I was such a threat to him.
Peggy?
I, along with everyone else, lost
every material possession that I had. I saw my family lose their home, their school, their bank account, everything. Everything went to attorneys, every last penny. I lost my career. I went 6 years to college to teach special ed, and the state has revoked my teaching credentials.
And some of the children that have accused her she wasn't even in the school.
How long were you at the school? That is the McMartin Preschool.
I was there 5 weeks in 1978 as a substitute teacher, and that's all I was there.
And you, Miss Smith?
4 years.
4 years. And you were charged basically with doing what?
Oral copulation on children and having children do it to me.
At this point, only Raymond Buckey and his mother, Peggy Buckey, were still facing charges.
Raymond Buckey has been held without bail in Los Angeles County Jail for the last 2.5 years.
Why are you talking to us now? You've never spoken to a reporter before, my understanding.
No.
Why are you talking now?
I think it's time.
Why?
I think the tide is turning where people are stepping back out of the hysteria that grew out of this and looking at us. Wait a minute. There's too much here that can be disproved. And we want to see that person. People want to see, look at me, because I think everybody believes that they can look into someone's eyes and is the monster that I've been claimed, that I've been made out to be. Everybody would have known it.
You never, repeat, never had anything of a sexual nature take place between you, Ray, and any of these children?
Never. I think some of the children have actually come to believe it happened. They've been told so many times, they've been reinforced by what they were led to say from the very beginning. If they can get up on the stand and say, yeah, Ray did that to me. Well, how did he do it? What position you're in? I don't remember. They can't give you any specifics because it never happened. To be led to say something at that young of age and to believe the adults that are around you that are reinforcing you to say it, you're going to believe it after a while.
They dropped the charges against 5 of the defendants. It's only you and your mother who are involved now.
Yeah.
Why?
You know, you've got to have a scapegoat. You have 2 people in jail for 2 years. You're going to back off there and say, oh, sorry, they're innocent too? It's an amazing fact how you can have the same evidence and the same children testifying against all 7, but you can say there's weak evidence against 5 of them.
We know what's going to happen if you're found guilty by a jury.
Yeah.
You're going to go to prison for a long, long time, obviously.
If I survive in there.
What do you mean?
They'd mark me. They'd mark me if I'm free or if I'm put in prison.
You're in prison, you're afraid that something could happen to you at the hands of the prison population.
I'm not afraid, I'm aware of the reality of prison.
And if you go free?
They've ruined my life. I've watched them ruin my family. I've watched them ruin my mother and grandmother's lives. I've watched them ruin my sister's career. I was just starting at that school. I hadn't made up my mind of what I wanted to do in life. But they burned a scarlet letter on me that I can never get rid of. I don't know what kind of life I would have. I can't trust people anymore because I've seen it too much. The politics, the corruption, the evil, the anger, the ignorance.
Raymond Buckey was held for a further 3 years until he was finally able to raise the money for bail when the judge dropped the bail charge from $3 million to $1.5 million. At this point, he had been held in custody for nearly 5 years without being charged. In 1990, his mother was acquitted of all charges, and finally, after 2 trials, one in which he was cleared of 52 of the 65 counts, and the second where the case was eventually dismissed due to the jury being unable to reach a verdict, Raymond Buckey was finally free.
What do you want to do in your life? I want to be left alone. I've seen what the news media can do to people in a crowded situation, and I don't want to be in LA, and I want to be left alone.
There were at least some journalists and news outlets that took time to reflect on what had happened with the McMartins and maybe look inwardly on how they could do better in future. And while that's a very small victory, it's at least something.
But it is doubtful that anyone will conclude that the way this trial was handled and covered by the media reflects much credit on either U.S. journalism or the U.S. legal system. Innocent people have had their reputations smeared and their lives turned upside down. Very young children who may or may not have been sexually abused have certainly been traumatized by endless hours of relentless examination and cross-examination in pretrial and courtroom hearings. Whatever else will be said about the McMartin case, it will never be cited as a proud example of our criminal justice system.
It brings into focus that our American culture can do harm to our children in the next generation, to win at all costs, to have a great publicity run, to jump the ratings and make it for a day. Those are all adult aspirations at the sacrifice of children.
And as I said way back near the beginning of this video, this is just one case.
We all would like our names cleared. And that to me is almost second to, I think people have to know what happened here. I think people in the world need to know this was a witch hunt, that nothing happened at the school, and it could happen to anyone. Because it can, and it has been. It's happening all over the country. Because of this case, it has happened everywhere. And if people realize nursery schools aren't places where children are being molested and raped and sodomized, it doesn't happen. It didn't happen in ours.